So what's going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Suddenly it seems they are making out. China came and told two jilted lovers that, look, you can't be fighting anymore. It's time to kiss and make up. And so they have. Now, this might seem quite ordinary to most people, but, and here's a big but, Saudi Arabia is the big Sunni power. It is the custodian of the two holy sites of Mecca and Medina. It was home in its early avatar when there was no state of Saudi Arabia to Muhammad, none other than what Muslims call Prophet Muhammad. So Muhammad comes up in this part of the world, claims he's a prophet, and now over 1 billion people follow him. And the custodian of the sites, the House of Saud, have extraordinary cultural hegemony over much of the Islamic world. The Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1919. Until then, the Caliph, the last person to hold the office, was the Ottoman Sultan. Out went the Ottoman Sultan, despite a movement in modern-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh called the Khilafat movement. And in came a period of transition. But once oil came to the fore, bubbling from under the sand, Saudi Arabia has had pole position. They have had the money, they have had the ideological fervor, they have backed Wahhabi ideology all across from Bosnia to Indonesia, and they are the top dogs in the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia, however, is not the only Muslim power. There is another Muslim power, and it is a Shia power, Iran. The age-old Sunni-Shia schism plays out now in geopolitical and even ethnic terms. So you have Arab Saudi Arabia versus Farsi or Fars or Iranian Iran. And Iran is Sunni. Iran is Shia. Ismail I, of course, created a great empire, the Safavids, and the Safavids, along with the Ottomans, were the two dominant Muslim empires. Of course, there were the Mughals too at a later period. So, at that time, Saudi Arabia wasn't even a blip on the map. The Islamic powers were all the way from Turkey, Iran, and the Mughals. And Iran sees itself as this historic great power in the region. After all, they have a memory that goes back before Islam. And Iran, as the leader of the Shia Islam, as a theocratic state, has a lot of hold amongst the Shia parts of the world. The Iran-Saudi Arabia tensions didn't always exist. After 1945, what happened was very simple. Ibn Saud made a deal with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yes, I'm right. February 14th, 1945, Valentine's Day, the year the World War II ended. They got together on USS Quincy, they had a powwow, and they decided upon something very simple. They had a very simple deal. The United States promised the House of Saud that they would provide it protection. And the House of Saud said, we will provide you oil. And that deal over the decades stuck. Except for a tiny little recent development. Now America is energy independent. Now America is even talking about moving to clean energy. So America is not really importing Saudi oil. Who is? Well, it's China. China is the biggest importer of Saudi oil. And so the economic center of gravity for Saudi Arabia has been moving east. The same holds true for Iran. Iran was also an American ally, except for a brief period under Mossadegh, who was ousted in a CIA coup in 1953, CIA and MI6 coup. Iran then under the Shah was a loyal American ally. But in 1979, there was a revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. Since then, Iran has been ruled by mullahs, big bearded guys, not big guys, but bearded chaps who think the law of the word is in the Quran and they know what is written in the Quran and therefore what they say is law, and women have to keep their heads covered. There's been a bit of a recent problem with that, but hey ho, there we go, they're still in charge. In 1979, there was also a problem in Saudi Arabia. In fact, jihadis took over the Grand Mosque. And then troops were sent in, and there was a whole kerfuffle, but the House of Saud survived. And a chap called Osama bin Laden was very impressed by all of this, but we won't go into that right now. Bottom line is that the revolution failed in Saudi Arabia, succeeded in Iran. Iran became a hostile anti-American revolutionary power. Saudi Arabia became this loyal bastion of American power. And therefore, since then, America has been seen as pro-Sunni and anti-Shia in a large part of the Islamic world. And these countries, well, at some point they started talking after a lot of tensions for a while. In 1980, when the Iraq-Iran war broke out under Saddam Hussein, America favored, of course, Saddam, but so did Saudi Arabia. They favored their Sunni compatriot against Shia Iran, and Shia Iran survived. And there were tensions that built up all the way from Lebanon to Yemen, and of course Yemen has been seeing civil war recently. Everywhere you had Shia-Sunni divide, these two countries started jockeying for power. They've been jockeying recently in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and that tension has continued. But in 1998, there was a relative thaw. They talked to each other. In 2001, they re-established relations. But by 2015, after a tragedy in Hajj, when a lot of people were trampled, both countries were again at loggerheads. And in 2016, when a Shia cleric in the eastern province, which is where you find all the Saudi oil, when he was executed, Sheikh Nimr, or Ayatollah Nimr, Iran threw a fuss, mobs stormed the Saudi embassy, and Saudi Arabia and Iran broke off relations. Now, they have re-established relations, despite all their rivalries. Why? Well, the answer is one word: China. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran now depend on China. Iran's closest big backer today is China. Saudi Arabia's biggest purchaser of oil is China. Saudi Arabia gets technology. Saudi Arabia gets investment. Saudi Arabia gets money through petro-yuan, if not dollars, actually both in dollars and petro-yuan, from China. China is increasingly a power that Saudi Arabia feels more comfortable with. In 2018, when Jamal Khashoggi was chopped up, allegedly on the instructions of Mohammed bin Salman in Istanbul by his henchmen, relations between the US and Saudi Arabia went down. In fact, US President Joe Biden promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state when he was on campaign trail. When the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, then of course Biden tried to kiss and make up, but MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, was unwilling. Biden's democracy agenda also upset MBS a lot. And MBS also saw the support of the so-called Arab Spring. I prefer to call it Arab uprisings because they didn't happen during the spring, as betrayal of the ruling families that had been loyal to America. Because a lot of these Gulf monarchies saw this wave of public protests as fundamentally destabilizing and fundamentally the tip of a spear that would rip through their control of power and probably through their sternums too. As we know, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was killed by a mob, and the House of Saud was petrified by this. So the Democratic president and Joe Biden and his Democratic agenda don't go down too well with MBS. Therefore, MBS has been basically thumbing his nose at Uncle Biden. Biden flew all the way, requested him to increase oil production. Instead, he cut it. And increasingly, the oil producers have been moving closer to Russia in some ways because they want to keep the price of oil up. So what we are seeing is a fundamental breakdown of the Ibn Saud, Franklin Delano Roosevelt deal. Now the House of Saud, A, does not feel it has guaranteed its security by the US, and B, the US does not need any Saudi oil. And so the deal is really off. enter the dragon. Xi Jinping walks in, and his new policies, Belt and Road Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and God knows, the new Global Civilization Initiative now are basically an outreach. And he basically is now the patron. He basically is now the top dog that both China and Iran are looking to, and they want peace in the Persian Gulf. They don't war. The Chinese don't want war between Iran and Saudi Arabia because that'll push the price of oil very high, and China has no energy. China still imports solids energy. So China puts pressure on both of them to make peace, and they are doing so for their own interests as well. And we are seeing a curious new world emerge.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.